Having a logical separation between presentation layer, business logic layer, and data access layer is always a best practice. In this lesson, we will understand how to create this logical separation for our project. Here I am at the directory that was cloned for our API project. I will simply copy this path and will create a new ASP.NET Core project at this location. We will select ASP.NET Core Web Application, and for the path we will select our copied path and we will give it a name BB Bank APIs. We will select API as our default template. This will give us a solution with the web project in it. This project will also be served as a controller layer for our application. As discussed in the layered picture, this application or this particular project is going to have all of the controllers in our application. Right now it just has a default controller which is called a weather controller. We won't be using it, but there is no harm to keep it there. Let's understand this project a bit further. It has a startup file which will be served as a place where we can configure our HTTP request pipeline, and if there are any services required to be configured, they will be configured here as well. And then by default it is using the default ASP.NET MVC's routing, and it has a folder called controller which has most of the controllers there. And it has a folder called controller which will have our controllers. Since we are making a bank project, it's going to have a controller called an accounts controller. This particular controller will hold all the APIs endpoint that are required to handle accounts. So let's create that controller. We will right click controller and we will add controller, and we are going to select API and we are going to add an empty API controller, and we are going to call it accounts controller, and it has a default route which is actually ASP.NET Core's attribute routing concept. So whenever we have to reach this controller, we have to put API / and then the name of a controller and then the name of a function to reach that particular function. The first function we are going to create here is actually about getting all the accounts, and we will call it get all controller or get all function. So this function is going to return all accounts. Plus please note that we don't have an account class yet. We will be creating a models layer and we will create this account class in that layer. Please note that this controller layer is going to serve as an entry and exit to the system. It will not contain any business logic. So it will receive a request and it will return a response. And it is always ideal to not have any business logic in this particular layer. To hold a business logic, we will have a separate layer, and that will be called a business logic layer. With that, we understand that we need to create two layers right now. One to create the business logic, and the second one to hold the models. So let's create these layers. We will right click the solution and we will add a new project. Like earlier, it is going to be a .NET Core's class library project, and we are going to call it models, or let's call it entities. It is going to hold all of our entities, and the first one we are going to rename it and call it account entity, since we are making bank's project and the most major part of a bank is actually account. So we are going to call it account, and we are going to rename this as well. The first property we are going to have here is account number, and the second property we are going to have here is account title. And then let's create the third project. The third layer which we discussed is actually the BusinessLogic Layer. So we will create a new project. Same, we are going to select class library.NET Core, and we will call it BusinessLogic. And it is going to give us a default class. So let's recap a bit what we have. We have an API layer which is serving as entry and exit point to the system. It has a function called getAllAccounts, but the entity it is going to return is not yet in our system. We have just created it, but it's not yet referenced. So what we will do is that we will simply add the reference to the entity we just entities project we just created. So we will right click, add, and we are going to add a project reference, and we are going to select entity. The moment we add that, now it is giving us an option to use these entities. So now this is resolved. And the other error it is giving us that there is nothing returned from here right now. For now, we will just return null to just get rid of this error. So we have accounts controller, which is actually supposed to return all accounts. And please, like I described earlier, it is just an entry and exit point to the system. There is no logic in it. It is going to call the business logic layer for all sorts of logic that is required to run as a result of this function when this function is called. And if this function is going to require data access, for that we are going to approach a DataAccess Layer, and that DataAccess Layer is also part of logic. So this will not be called from within this layer. Instead, it will be called from the BusinessLogic Layer. So if a BusinessLogic Layer is going to access any sort of data, it is going to call the DataAccess Layer. So let's create that layer. Same way we did in accounts in the case of model, and in the case of model project and the BusinessLogic project, we will going to create another layer, and this is going to be the DataAccess Layer. We will come back to this layer later, but right now our project have 4 layers. And the first one is the controller API layer, which we discussed that will going to hold all the controllers of our system, of our project. The BusinessLogic Layer is going to have all the business logic in our system. And if a BusinessLogic Layer need to access a data, it is going to call the DataAccess Layer. And if both BusinessLogic Layer, API layer, or the DataAccess Layer need to refer any entity in our system, it's going to be called from the entities project. As you can see in the picture that the entities layer was a common layer, which was a cross-cutting layer between all the layers. So with this, let's return some accounts from our business logic layer. We will delete this default class and we will add a new class, and we are going to call it accounts service. This account service is going to have a function that is going to return a list of accounts. Right now we are not going to set up the DataAccess Layer. In a later section we will be In a later video within the same module, we are going to set up a DataAccess layer with entity framework, but right now we are just going to create some default account using just initialization, and we are going to return it from the BusinessLogic layer. So we will be having a function called getAllAccounts. So this function is going to return list of all accounts. So public get all accounts, and the return type is going to be list of account, and here we are going to resolve this account, and the way we are going to resolve it is that we are going to add reference to our entities project. So add a project reference, and we will add a reference to the entity project, and since we have added it, we can now resolve it, and we will create accounts array is equal to new list of account, and this is going to be the array list we are going to return. To populate this list, we are going to add few accounts. So let's add a new account. We are going to give it account number 1101, and we are going to give it some account title. Let's give it John Doe. Then we are going to create another account, and let's give it a name Andrew Mike, anything. So with this setup, now what we have is a BusinessLogic layer with a function that is actually returning all the accounts. Let's go to our controller layer and consume this BusinessLogic layer from within there. So we will go to the controller layer, and we will initialize this BusinessLogic layer. We will create an instance of the account service within the controller layer, but to resolve that, like other layers we did, we have to add the BusinessLogic layer's reference inside the controller layer. So we are going to add, and then we are going to add the project reference and make sure that the BusinessLogic is selected. Once this is selected, we can simply put the using statement and it will work. And then from within this layer, the function we are going to call is getAllAccounts. This particular function has a list of all the accounts, and then it will return it from within the BusinessLogic layer. We are going to give a route to this function that will be called to access this particular function, and let's see how it runs. By default, it is executing the weather's forecast controller, but we are going to go to the route API /accounts/getAll, and as you can see, it is returning the account. But let's put a breakpoint and understand what's happening here. So I will put a breakpoint in the entry point to the system, and then I will call this method again. As you can see, it hit the breakpoint, and this is an entry point to the system, and it is not executing any business logic. It is initializing the account service, and then it is going inside the account service. It is creating a new object, fetching the accounts it is required, adding it in the return array and returning. And then once that is executed, it is returning from the controller layer, and here we have the result of it. In the coming sections, we are going to replace this hard-coded logic that is inside the account service about creating the accounts array, accounts list, and populating it with actually our entity framework DB context that will be residing in the DataAccess layer. So we will have a DataAccess layer that will have a DB context of entity framework and will be attached to an original database, which will be fetching everything from that database into the accounts service business logic layer, and from there it is going to return it to the controller. Let's recap one more time. We have an entry point to the system, which is our API's controller layer. This layer have bunch of controllers, and the controller we created is accounts controller. This controller has a function called getAll, and which will be reached if we go to a route called getAll. And this function is initializing the business logic layer. We added the reference of accounts controller. We added the reference of business logic layer inside the account API controller, and then we initialize up one particular service, and we call a function of that service. That service is actually our business logic layer. This business logic layer have the account service, and this service right now is accumulating the list of accounts to be returned to the controller layer. We have a DataAccess layer which is not set yet. We will be working on it in the coming videos. But we also have an entities layer. This layer is actually a common layer between all the other layers. And if some layer have to access a particular entity or refer a particular entity, they have to have a reference to this particular project. With this, let's move to our next video.